Kara, what the hell were you trying to prove out there?
I was stopping bad guys. That's what we do, right?
Stop them, not scramble them.
Don't lecture me, Cal. I'm still older than you.
No, you may have left Krypton that way, but you're not anymore. The wormhole got me here faster.
That's not fair.
Tell it to Einstein.
Who?
Smart guy, lived here on Earth. Do your homework.
Why don't you do yours?
Excuse me?
You've spent your whole life on this planet. You grew up with these powers. Do you even remember Krypton? Your parents? My parents?
Only a little.
Well, for me, it was only several months ago. I didn't have powers. Nobody did. And when bad things happened, we were helpless.
Kara, I can't know unless you tell me.
Ask regular people down there how they feel when guys like that terrorize them. I have powers now. And I'm going to use them.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming back a returning guest, and that is fellow podcaster Anthony Desiato. Anthony, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming back on. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. So people know you from Digging for Kryptonite, and in a bit of a twist, we're having the Superman podcaster on this show to actually talk about a Superman movie for once, since usually we've been talking about Marvel movies every time you come on.
You would think that I got my fill of talking about Superman on my own show, yet apparently I still have an appetite for more. But this was perfect because on my show, we have talked about the comic book storyline that this movie that we're going to talk about was adapted from, but we've not talked on Digging for Kryptonite about this specific animated movie. And to be perfectly honest, I don't really have a spot for it. So this was perfect.
Well, that works out because when I sent out a call to inviting former guests on and you sent me back an email and you said, oh, yeah, let's do Superman Unbound. At first, I was a little bit surprised. I'd had to double check the email address, but I'm really glad you decided to talk about it. I haven't seen this movie in a number of years, and this was actually my first introduction to the Superman Brainiac story. I ended up reading it later on after I saw the movie. But before we dig too much into that, what kind of stuff are you interested in lately? Anything grabbing your attention?
Oh, man, that's a great question. I forgot that you always start off with that, and I don't have anything prepared. Oh, actually, though, I do have a good answer. I finally started watching The Bear, the FX show, and it's terrific. I've heard that the third season, the most recent season, kind of fell off a bit, but I'm in season 1 right now and enjoying it a lot. So I would go with that, The Bear.
I've never even heard of this. What's that all about?
Oh, yeah. So it's Jeremy Allen White, and he plays this chef who comes from a high-end restaurant who comes back to his family's small town restaurant and takes over and deals with all of the personalities and challenges that arise there. So it's like technically a comedy, but one of those ones that kind of walks that line between comedy and drama. So it's set in Chicago, so a big city show, but the restaurant itself is kind of like a neighborhood joint sort of thing.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm gonna have to see if that's available anywhere here because I know a lot of the FX stuff is available here on like Hulu or Disney Plus. So I'm gonna have to look into that. For my part, there are actually two things that I'm in that really caught my attention. First off is I finally watched. I got to see Deadpool and Wolverine. My wife had some impromptu vacation time, so we got to take a day off and go see it while the kids were at preschool. And I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see it yet, but it was so much fun. Like it's just two plus hours of nothing but pure fan service and surprisingly a surprisingly moving tribute to like all the non-Marvel Studios movies because we got lots of cameos there. I'm not going to spoil anything for those who haven't seen it, but lots of great cameos from like the Fox movies and some of the other non-Disney Marvel movies. Some very surprising ones. The storyline involving Wolverine was great. Bit of a question mark at the end as to how this is going to fit together in the MCU now, but overall I loved it. I thought it had a lot of the same energy that No Way Home had, and it had a lot of what I had hoped the Flash was going to do. So it was great to, and also at the same time, it was kind of making fun of these types of multiverse things. So it was kind of it was a nice little treat, and it was just pure fun. I was freaking out at all the cameos in the theater, so much so that my wife was like completely surprised at some of my reactions.
Oh, that's amazing. I have not had a chance to see it yet. I'm hoping to be able to get to it next week, ideally. But I can't wait. And you've sold me on it even more. I'm really excited.
Yeah. And the other thing is my wife and we started watching the last season of Cobra Kai. And we're about, I think, like maybe 5 or 6 episodes in so far. And that show, I'm always amazed at how great they do the cliffhanger stuff. Like every time I'm watching, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is good. I think we'll be done after this episode. And then they throw something at us at the cliffhanger. I'm just like, next one's only 30 minutes. Let's go with the next one.
I know. So now you're finishing season 5, and then you have the first chunk of season 6, or you're in the season 6 batch?
We're in the season 6 batch. We're like in
Okay.
like 5 or 6 episodes into season 6.
Okay, because we're current on that as well. Because I know they're releasing the 6th and final season, 15 episodes released in 3 5-episode chapters.
Oh,
So
really? I
we've
didn't
watched
realize
all
that.
5 of we've watched all 5 of season 6 that are out so far, and yeah, I'm right there with you, man. It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah, yeah. You know what I realized, and you're the perfect guy to come on at this moment when I'm watching it, because when I'm watching the power couples together, you know, Sam and Miguel and Robbie and Tori, and when they're in that this like amusement center, one of the things that struck me is I'm just like, you know what? This would kind of have the makings of like a really good Power Rangers revival with these characters.
Dude, 1,000%. I remember when we had that Power Rangers reboot movie. Was it 2016, 2017?
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, spoiler alert, but we get a mid-credit scene that teases Tommy Oliver. And if I'm not mistaken, I feel like at the time or in the years since, Taylor Buchanan, who plays Robbie, I feel like his name was kind of thrown about as fan casting essentially. And it's like, yeah, man, I could see that. But no, totally. Like it definitely has that. If they could do a Power Rangers series or movie with that kind of vibe, oh man, it would be great. Because I think it would, much like Cobra Kai itself, appease the long-term fans like us who grew up with it, but also speak to a new generation. I think the template is like right there.
It is. It is. I'm surprised I never thought of it before, but I'm just watching. I'm like, and if you're rounding out the cast, I'm like, Hawk and Dimitri, they kind of fit in that mold as well. So you've got the entire cast right there, and they've already got the skills and everything to just go ahead and run with this. And yeah, like with Cobra Kai, because my wife, she never watched any of the Karate Kids growing up. Like we watched the first season of Cobra Kai, and after that, she's like, I want to watch the movies now. And then we watched the movies, and so now she's all caught up to it. But yeah, and she got even more, I think, invested in it than I did when we watched that first season. But anyway, like we said, today we are going to be talking about a Superman movie for once, a change of pace with you on, and that is the animated Superman Unbound, which came out in 2013. And this was back in the era when Warner Brothers Animation, they were still doing these like direct adaptations of these different comic book stories. You had like The Dark Knight Returns, you had Gotham by Gaslight, and a whole bunch of other, like the Superman Batman ones, and so on and so forth.
Superman versus the Elite was another one.
Superman versus the Elite, yes, absolutely. Which we had covered here before, actually. And this one of the things that first kind of surprised me about it is the fact that they went with the title Unbound. Like that seems kind of like a weird choice, because Superman Brainiac, maybe they didn't want to have it confused with the Brainiac Attacks movie that came out a few years earlier, but that was the only thing I could think of. What did you think about that choice of title? Because it felt like an odd choice for me.
Awful title. I can't imagine that served it well. And I don't think I ever really thought about it when it originally came out. And let me just say, because this sent me down the rabbit hole of memory, I was thinking about it. I'm 99% sure I just watched this the one time when it first came out, and never in all the years since. So I mean, it felt somewhat familiar as I was watching it, but mostly I was coming at it with fresh eyes, I would say. But that was one of the things I was thinking about was the title. It's so curious. And I came to the same conclusion you did. I assume Like you said, they wanted to distance it from Brainiac attacks, but you could have gone in any number of directions. And I don't think it would have been fatal to the movie to incorporate Brainiac in some way. Like you said, just call it Superman Brainiac or Superman versus Brainiac. It's like even if Brainiac's in the title, you can still differentiate it. So it's just Unbound is just so generic and really has nothing to do. Honestly, dude, if they had called it Unbottled, I would have been like, oh, okay, like actually that makes sense. Like they could have called it Superman Bottle City, and then at least you get the comic book fans who are like, oh, I know we're in Brainiac Candor territory, and for the the non-initiated, it's like, just kind of go with it. So such an odd choice. And then the other thing I'm glad you brought up about that era of animated movies, because I was looking up the list on Wikipedia, and this was, assuming Wikipedia is correct, the last one before they entered that new line of animated movies that was based on the New 52, and then those movies started sharing continuity. But there was this stretch in between, like from when they started with Superman Doomsday through this one, where there were a couple that had connective tissue between them, but for the most part, they were standalone, and a lot of them, like you said, were these adaptations of comic book storylines. So this was kind of the end of an era of these DC animated movies in a way. But yeah, man, awful, awful title.
Yeah, and it's just the title, like you said, it's generic, and also it implies something that has nothing to do with anything in this movie. Like we don't see Superman losing control or like going, or going too far or going to any sort of extremes or anything like that. So yeah, it's a very odd choice for the title. Um, Now, I like you said in the intro, you talked about the comic book story before on your podcast, but just kind of as a refresher for me as well, but also for the audience who may not have listened to that episode. What did you think of the comic story it was based on?
That story and the entire Jeff Johns run on Action Comics during that period of time, they grew on me considerably over the years. At the time, and I've talked about this a lot on my show, but I was very much still caught up in the post-crisis era of the character in the comics that it felt like they were moving away from. This was a period of time following Infinite Crisis, again, when Jeff Johns was writing Action Comics, and we were seeing this infusion of a lot of pre-crisis elements back into the books, and it felt like it was moving away from the version of the character I grew up with. So at the time, I kind of felt like, oh, this isn't quote unquote my Superman. Now I can come at it with a different perspective and really enjoy the stories for what they are. And I think Superman Brainiac in particular is strong. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the aspects that made the comic book story resonate for me are just absent here. For one example, in the comic, you get this revelation that all of the prior incarnations of Brainiac that Superman has encountered over the years, including the post-crisis version that I grew up with, they were all probes of the original Brainiac, and Superman's never met the one true Brainiac. Here in the movie, again, that aspect is just not there, and he's just meeting Brainiac for the first time, and Supergirl's filling him in as she fills him in the comic, so that part remains. But you don't have that history with the idea of Brainiac or other versions of Brainiac. And then there's the Jonathan Kent of it all, which we can talk about as well. But again, there are key aspects of the comic book storyline that I think make it work for me that they're just not here. So I didn't get as much mileage out of the movie, I suppose.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that thing about the Brainiac thing, because I think one of my maybe my favorite thing about Superman the animated series is how they revamped Brainiac, and they made him this artificial intelligence that was part of Krypton and all that, and knew about Krypton's impending destruction and decided it was just going to preserve knowledge and culture and all that. And I latched on to that version of Brainiac so hard, so much so that when I discovered the Brainiac in the comic books, I was completely taken aback because he's just so different from what my impression is. And I'm probably biased because the Superman the animated series one is my first real introduction to the character, but I really prefer that version. So when Jeff Johns came in and he had introduced these changes where he had brought in a lot of these pre-crisis aspects, like you said, but also combining stuff from the animated series, like the animated series version of Toyman, and also stuff from the Reeve films, like with the Fortress of Solitude, the Jor-El AI, and all that kind of stuff. And then when he brought in Brainiac too, and said, you've never met the real Brainiac. The real Brainiac is this cyborg AI thing that's basically stays in this skull ship. I thought that was such a it's one of the better retcons Johns has done, because I know you've talked about this on your show many times. Like when Johns goes through and he changes stuff and he messes with continuity, it can be a mixed bag. Sometimes he does devote a lot of care and effort to it. Sometimes it just kind of feels like, let's just hand wave this stuff away really quickly so we can move on. And I think this one was one of the better versions of that.
Yeah, I'll say this. Even though I grew up with the Milton Fine version of Brainiac in the post-crisis era, which listeners, if you know, you know, and if not, you know, you can look it up. That's its own thing. But even though I grew up with that version, I don't think I ever felt like that was the Brainiac, to be perfectly honest. And so I think what Johns did in this instance was the right call. I think this is the stronger take on Brainiac. I'm with you, though. I think Superman the Animated Series is the best. And in fact, when I had legendary longtime Superman editor Mike Carlin on my other Superman podcast where we talk about the George Reeves show, he brought up Brainiac and he was like, we should have done that in the comics. He was like, the idea of it being a Kryptonian AI creation, like that's what we should have done. So I think that's probably truly the most compelling version of it. But I think what Johns did work. Now, when Johns would then play like the exact same card with Toyman in his Action Comics run. That's where I'm like, all right, how many times are we going to do this where you find out that you weren't really dealing with the real one all along? So I think there's a line and there's a balance to be struck, but I think it worked well in the case of Brainiac. Speaking of Brainiac, have you read the House of Brainiac crossover?
Is that a more recent thing?
Yeah, it's very recently concluded in the Superman titles, written by Joshua Williamson.
Okay, no, I'm only up to what was it? Supercorp is like the most recent one, I
Okay.
think.
No, you're not that far off then. But when you get there, I don't want to spoil anything, but when you get there, just in terms of seeing these multiple versions represented, I think you'll be quite pleased. And I actually, if you'll indulge me a quick plug here. I have an episode coming up on Digging for Kryptonite with our mutual friends, Bernie Gersmeyer and Justin DeVoe. And we recorded in studio. We had a lot of fun and we talked all about it. But I think you'll enjoy that one. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts after you read it.
I'm really looking forward to that, and to that episode. Like I saw you posting the photos of all three of you together, and I've been playing email tag with them, trying to get both of them back on at some point in the near future. So so hopefully we can get that going soon. Now back to this movie. Another thing that was one of the things that really drove me nuts about this was the character design of Superman. Just like it's just, I think like I thought all the other characters I think look great. I think the animation, all the other characters looks great. The design looks great, but Superman, it just feels very weird. I think he's too bulky, I feel like, and like maybe like a little bit overly muscular in a way it's not like the Ed McGuinness style one where it works in a weird way. This one, it feels off. And also his face is just way too long and way too angular. So it just kept distracting me the whole time. How did you feel?
Dude, 1,000%. So long, angular, lanky, like those are the words that I kept coming back to. I mean, there are separate scenes where he hugs Kara in this, which by the way, I've talked about this a lot too, the pronunciation of Supergirl's real name. And I've been worn down, despite Smallville calling her Kara. We've heard it Kara everywhere else. So now in my head, it's Kara. So here in this, hearing Kara, I'm like, what is this? Anyway, but a scene where he's hugging Kara and then another scene where he's hugging Lois. And it's just, he is large, but I don't know. It's just like the way he was dwarfing them. It just like, it was off. But no, I had that same thought. And this is the thing that breaks my heart with these animated movies, the adaptations in particular, because we've seen instances and it was so, I don't know. It's so like hit or miss with this, where sometimes they would try to emulate the style of the artist whose work was being adapted. I think Superman, Batman, Public Enemies is a perfect example of that, where
Absolutely.
it's like Ed McGuinness's art on screen. It's like, oh my God, this is great. And then plenty of other instances, and this is an example of it, where there was just no attempt. And Gary Frank did the art of the comic that this was based on. And this is not an instance of, oh, like we can kind of tell they're taking elements. It literally says in the credits, based on Superman Brainiac by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. And Gary Frank so clearly was drawing Christopher Reeve as Superman. So I don't know. It's just, it would have been really beautiful to see Frank's art in some way, shape, or form emulated. And they just didn't do that at all. And it's, again, I don't want to be overly negative, but it's like if they had come up with a better design or something that suited the story, that we're like, oh, okay, I could see why they changed it. But it just, it didn't look right. But to your point, like Supergirl, I thought looked great. So they got it in some instances, but the Superman design, man, was rough.
Yeah, and you know what? It I was thinking about that too when you talked about the other movies and how the ones in this era, they had ones that, like Public Enemies and like The Dark Knight Returns or The New Frontier, where they perfectly captured that art style. Even if it wasn't like an exact one-to-one translation, it was evocative enough that you were able to kind of see where it came from. And then you have other ones like this one, and also like Superman versus the Elite, where I'm just kind of like, what were they thinking with these designs? As much as I love Superman versus the Elite, the design of it always throws me off.
No, I agree. And I don't know what the answer is because how do I put this? If they, like, let's say, even if the movies weren't sharing a continuity, but let's say they still came up with one set of character designs and that's what they used for all of them. It's like, okay, like I get it. Like I'll go along with that. Like they're not necessarily in a shared universe, but they're not going to redesign the characters every time.
Right.
But they end up redesigning the characters every time. And so if you're going to do that, even if it's not a one-to-one match, to try to bring some of that flavor when it is a direct adaptation. Because again, the examples, we've cited now, Public Enemies, New Frontier, it's like it goes such a long way. It adds this whole other dimension to it. And it's one of the things where, as we get deeper into these animated lines, like that, I think it's technically called the DC Animated Movie Universe, the DC AMU, the one that's based on the New 52.
Yeah, I mean it's so weird because you have the DCAU or the DCUA, which the Bruce Timm one, which I can never remember which one it is. I always alternate back and forth between them. And yeah, that one where it was like very similar, but it's still like they're both kind of a mouthful. And then thankfully the Tomorrowverse stuff just made it very easy.
Yeah, but the DCAMU, the one based on the New 52, like they did so at least, I mean, the one adaptation that immediately comes to mind is Hush. And then the Tomorrowverse did Long Halloween. And it's like in both of those instances, they made them kind of fit within their shared movie universe that was going on.
And the
But it's
death and
like, oh,
rebirth of Superman too.
yes, exactly. And in all of those instances, and again, the Death and Return in particular, I did enjoy those adaptations, but it's like, oh man, like I wish these could have been standalone and we could have just had the art styles from the books. So I don't know. All that being said, for this in particular, this is an especially curious choice because it's not a movie that's part of a shared universe. It's a standalone and it's an adaptation. And why they didn't go in the direction of the Gary Frank art or even something close to it, I don't know. But I do think the final product does suffer a bit for it.
Yeah, it was very distracting to me the whole time. But along with that too, about some of the choices they made with, again, this being a standalone movie. Another odd choice for me was you'd mentioned the Jonathan thing, which we can talk about too, because he's just completely absent from this, not even a presence at all. But the other thing that struck me was the decision to have Lois and Clark in a relationship, but having it be secret as opposed to having them be married, like in the original one, which felt very odd to me because and I might be misremembering, but didn't they have something similar with that in like Superman Doomsday as well?
So I recently guested on another podcast, and it won't be out until next year, but we talked about Superman Doomsday. So I literally watched these two movies within the span of a few days. And yes, in Superman Doomsday, the very first when they started this line of original animated movies direct to DVD, it was a similar type of dynamic there. The distinction was that Superman and Lois were in this relationship, but he had not yet told her that he's actually Clark. And she had pieced it together. It was sort of like this open secret between them. But the way the movie spun it was like this was the one part that he was still holding back. And he framed it in terms of, oh, I'm trying to keep you safe. Her take on it was that, oh, you're like a typical Earth male. You're afraid of commitment. Regardless of your interpretation, it kind of represented that last piece that he wasn't willing to kind of share to take that next step with her. And so it was weird jumping from that to Superman Brainiac or Unbound because it was a similar type of thing. I mean, again, the angle on it was different, but it was still this idea that, I mean, here that's so weird. It's like here she in Superman Unbound, she knows that Clark is Superman and they're in a relationship, but he won't let her go public with the fact that Lois and Clark are together. This bugged me to no end. I get what they're trying to do. I think it's this idea that just like Brainiac is bottling these cities, Clark is trying to bottle this relationship and keep it safe and keep Lois safe. I get that, but it's just weird. It's one of those things. It's like, dude, why do you even have a secret identity then? Like, is that is this not the whole point? It was weird. It just like it felt very artificial. And like I try not to be a comic book nerd about this stuff, but again, if we're talking about an adaptation, that's kind of the other thing that kicks in where it's like, well, in the comic that this is based on, Lois and Clark are married, like everyone knows they're married. So it was just like a weird, I don't know, man. It was a weird angle to take. I really didn't like it. And I don't think it reflects well on either of them, but especially Clark.
No, I agree. And like I understand when you're doing these adaptations and you're going to make changes to make it easier for the viewing audience, like for example, Superman versus the Elite. There's this whole scene in that original comic with Martian Manhunter coming in and all that, or you have other characters, other heroes involved and that kind of stuff. And they took all that stuff out of it, which I understand. Or in All-Star Superman, they took out the Jimmy stuff, right? It made sense to me. But in this, it's not like Superman and Lois and Clark being together is a big leap for the non-comic reading audience. Like it's something that we saw on Lois and Clark, we saw on Smallville, so people are willing to accept that aspect of the characters. So that seemed like an odd choice. They're going to say like, well, we're not going to have them together. And it does just seem this idea that they wanted to kind of force this parallel between Superman and Brainiac, where, like you said, Brainiac's bottling these cities. He's trying to keep things as they are. And at the same way, Superman, with his overprotective nature, he's doing that with Lois and their relationship. He's doing that to an extent with Kara as well. And yeah, that characterization of Superman really just kind of drove me a little bit nuts as well.
Yeah, it was weird. And I think they should have just focused on the Supergirl aspect. And that, I mean, that generally, I think that track that had probably had the closest parallel with the comics where she has the history with Brainiac and the knowledge of Brainiac and the fear of Brainiac. And here in the movie, they really play up this aspect of she was powerless on Krypton when Brainiac attacked. And now she has this power and she's going to use it. And she's a little bit more, kind of, I don't want to say brutal, but, she's really kind of goes for it, right? In her, as she dispenses justice. And especially when Superman's off world, you see her going after really inserting herself in these geopolitical affairs. And that was a whole other angle that didn't really get unpacked to the extent that I thought they might in this movie, because it was an interesting idea. She intervenes in North Korea, for example, and it's like, oh, is this going to lead to some political intrigue? And, they just really don't go down that road. But like, that's the aspect of the comic that I thought they were truest to, and probably the most interesting. And they could have, I don't know, they could have focused more on that. And that might have served them better as opposed to this Lois hiding the relationship angle.
Yeah. Although I will say one of the benefits of hiding the relationship angle is that we do get that funny bit with Steve Lombard in the beginning of the movie, which Diedrich Bader does the voice of him. And I thought he did a perfect job in all his scenes in this movie.
Yeah, he was a lot of fun for sure. It was cool to see him pop up.
And I definitely want to talk about the Supergirl part of it, because there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about with Supergirl. I thought I really enjoyed what they did with her, but we're going to take a quick break and we will be right back.
Since you're listening to this show, I already know you love watching superhero movies and TV shows, and you just might enjoy superhero comics. But how about superhero novels? I'm giving away 2 free superhero novels and 1 free superhero short story. Visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP to get access to Vanguard, Heroes Forged, the first novel in my own Avengers and X-Men inspired superhero novel series, and Ronin Born, my cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic Japan. I'm also throwing in Fire and Lightning, a free prequel story to my new Power Rangers inspired superhero series Omega Knights. So visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP, those are just the letters SCP, to get started, or click on the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
Welcome back to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. All right, now, before we took a break, we were going to talk about Supergirl. Now, for my part, I thought I loved pretty much everything they did with Supergirl in this. Like, it's been a few years since I've read this story, so I don't really recall the specifics of it, other than like the the broad strokes. So I don't recall a lot of the Supergirl relationship like you'd been mentioning before we took the break. But one of the things that really struck me was I liked how Supergirl was so brash, and also I think they did a really good job of accentuating the trauma that she's been through. Like she's seen this happen before, and then she loses her entire planet shortly after that, and it's only been basically in her mind, it's been like a few months, right? It's so recent for her. And like the way that she deals with it, the way she expresses that trauma. I thought Molly Quinn, who does the voice, did a really good job of expressing that in the voice acting, and the way that she is almost afraid to come to Metropolis. So that's part of the reason why she's getting involved in so many other things all over the place. All of that I thought was brilliantly done.
I agree. And speaking of the voice acting, by any chance, are you a Castle fan?
I am not, but I do want to check that out because I think finally, because for the longest time it was not available on streaming here, but I think now it's on Disney Plus over here. So I've been meaning to check that out because I love Nathan Fillion.
Interesting. So no, the reason I bring it up is that you have a pair of Castle alums voicing characters here. So you have Molly Quinn, who played Nathan Fillion's daughter on the show, and then you have playing Supergirl here, and then you have Stana Katic playing Lois Lane, and of course she was the female lead of Castle. And interestingly, you also have Matt Bomer playing Clark and Superman, and he would go on to voice Barry Allen in the Tomorrowverse, and Stana Katic would go on to voice the Earth 2 Wonder Woman in the Tomorrowverse. So it was just kind of interesting seeing them here, hearing them here in particular. But yeah, if you're a fan of Castle, it's like, oh, a lot of familiar voices.
Well, speaking of familiar voices, I thought one of the probably the best casting choice in this whole thing was John Noble as Brainiac. Like I thought his as soon as and I forgot he was in this movie. And then I had very recently I'd started like dipping back into Fringe again. And when I saw his name in the credits, like I sat up and I took notice, and then I was listening for him as Brainiac, and like he has this pitch perfect delivery, and then they added that reverb effect to his voice, and it works so well. What do you think about John Noble?
Yeah, no, I dug that take as well. It's funny going back to Superman the animated series. I feel like in my head I probably always hear Corey Burton. That's my default when it comes to Brainiac. But no, I thought John Noble did a great job. And you mentioned Fringe. I feel like I only ever watched the pilot of Fringe, and I was intrigued, but I never continued with it. But that's kind of always perpetually been on that list of like, oh, I'll go back to that. But no, I think the voice cast was great here for sure.
Yeah, Fringe was a great show, and he plays this I'm not sure if you remember much from the pilot, but he plays this like very eccentric mad scientist type, and he's a bit more emotional in the series. But having him as Brainiac, like it's just he's got this like perfect deadpan voice that just works very well. Like Corey Burton is hard to compete with, but I mean, if you're going to think of someone else to do the voice, I'm hard pressed to think of anyone who could have done a better job than John Noble.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a compelling take on Brainiac, I would say.
Yeah, and also we had and Matt Bomer too. More recently, not only from The Flash and the Tomorrowverse stuff, but he also did Negative Man on Doom Patrol.
Yeah, and I'm a huge White Collar fan. I watched that all the way through. I know there's apparently a revival in the works, so we'll see about that. But yeah, no, big Matt Bomer fan, and I know it's funny. I wasn't even thinking about this when I was watching it, but I know Matt Bomer, years ago was again when we're talking about fan castings. I know he was a name that kind of always popped up when you think of Clark, and in the live action realm, and certainly you can see that, but yeah, him getting to voice the character was cool. It was weird because I guess now I'm more used to hearing him as the Flash, so that took me a minute, but I think he, to his credit, there was a differentiation between his Clark and his Superman. Like there was clearly an effort that he was making with the two characters, so I appreciated that.
Yeah, I thought he did a pretty decent job. Not my favorite of these animated movies, but not the worst one either. Stana Katic as Lois Lane, I really liked her performance too. I thought she did a really good job of like conveying like Lois's tenaciousness and her like headstrong qualities, while also calling Clark to task for being unreasonable with his bullshit.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I feel like her vibe here was not it was not entirely dissimilar from her character on Castle. Like, it kind of felt a little bit in that vein. But yeah, I liked her a lot in this. And I had totally honestly, I had totally forgotten about her and Molly Quinn. I'd for the Castle connection was completely out of my head. So as I was watching it, I was like, oh, like that's pretty cool. Yeah, I thought they both did a great job.
And also, like I was saying, the designs of both of them I thought were great. They use the pre I guess we call it the pre New 52 version of Supergirl here, where she had the midriff and the blue skirt, which is not my favorite design, but I thought it worked for what they were doing here. Um, and and yeah, I just love the scenes when she's going into like North Korea and she is pushing things further. And Lois's delivery in that opening scene when the terrorists are taking her prisoner and Supergirl's the one who turns up, and Lois like, hey, you should probably be more afraid of her because she's young, she's headstrong, she's kind of got no time for any bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess maybe, well, that's part of our conversation. It's also a separate conversation, but about Supergirl herself. And I feel like this version of Supergirl in this era, again, I grew up with the post-crisis Matrix version, which once again, if you know, you know, but it was a very distinct iteration of the character. But I think when Jeff Loeb and Michael Turner reintroduced the kind of the pre-crisis version of the character, the Kara Zor-El version, who was Superman's cousin in the early to mid aughts, and this version that continues here, I do think it's a particularly compelling take, right? This idea that she was meant to be Kal-El's protector and ends up arriving after he's grown to adulthood and he's become the most revered superhero in the world, and sort of the position that puts her in. And then here you have the added layer of the Brainiac piece where she has this knowledge and this fear. Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, when we talk about the Superman family generally, but especially Supergirl, I think to the extent we can really kind of delineate who Superman is and who Supergirl is, that's where I think it gets more interesting. And I think these comic book storylines from this time and this movie, I do think really do kind of tap into that of showing how they're different. And I think that works. And I think that was an aspect of this that was strong.
So I'm not as familiar with this version of Supergirl. Like I only know her from like ancillary stuff, like Superman, Batman, like this Superman Brainiac story. So I'd never really experienced like her core title. Was that title? I assume you've read it since you know a little bit more about this. Was that title worth reading?
So I'll be perfectly honest, I've not read
Okay.
that series. So it's weird, man. Like Jeff Loeb, who again reintroduced the Kara Zor-El version of the character in Superman Batman, he would then go on to launch that Supergirl title and wrote the first arc. Then it went through a couple of writers. I mean, Greg Rucka had an aborted run. He was supposed to be the regular writer, and he ended up doing only a few issues. And then I think Joe Kelly was on it for a while. Kelly Puckett was on it, and then Sterling Gates came on. And this is when we're in the post Infinite Crisis era of the title, and we get into that new Krypton saga, which, on the one hand, the book ended up being part of a larger, ended up being a piece of a larger puzzle, but still was able to do its own thing. And that run was particularly strong. So the Sterling Gates piece of it in particular, if you were curious about reading, an aspect of it, that's kind of what I would point to. But again, went through multiple writers. I have not read all of it. It's not the sort of thing where I would say it's really cohesive series throughout because it really kind of went through different permutations. But uh, for you or for any listeners, I guess if you liked that Superman Batman arc by Jeff Loeb and Michael Turner, definitely read the first arc of that Supergirl series of the era, because very much a continuation of that Superman Batman story. And then the Sterling Gates run, which I do believe has been collected in a pretty handy series of trades. So even though it's connecting to this larger New Krypton story, I think you still can kind of follow that thread with Supergirl specifically.
And I've got the new Krypton trades already, so I'm safe on that front.
Nice.
Because my experience with Supergirl is, I was first introduced to Supergirl through the Matrix Supergirl and the Death of Superman story, so that was like my first introduction to her. and I've got vague memories of the Helen Slater movie, so I think I had watched that at some point. I think when I first saw Matrix Supergirl, I was kind of confused at like this whole protoplasmic being thing. But other than that, like that was the Supergirl I was quote unquote most familiar with for a long time. And then and obviously the TV show with Melissa Benoist, where the take on Supergirl in that, it was very similar to like kind of like an over enthusiastic version of Superman, I think is the best way to describe her. Which was fun. I liked it, especially in those early seasons. But this take on Supergirl, where they're, I mean, part of the thing they had there was they didn't have to differentiate her from Superman. So they could do a lot more like Superman type stuff and like make it kind of like this pre-crisis bubbly version of Superman, which worked in those early seasons. I thought she was, you know, infectiously giddy in those early seasons, especially. The stories kind of lost me in the later seasons. I still haven't finished that final season, but this take here and watching how she acts in this movie, just in this movie alone, made me very curious about this take. And you said, as you reminded me, that did come from the comic book. So I am more curious in her comic book run from this era than anything else, because I think you're right. I think having some sort of differentiation between Superman and these other characters in the super family is really necessary. That's one of the reasons why I gravitate so much to the Connor Kent Superboy. And so I am very curious now to look at those Supergirl comics from this time.
Yeah, I mean, I check them out. I think it's funny, like yourself, right? My introduction to Supergirl was that post-crisis protoplasmic matrix iteration, who then bonded with a human and became an Earthborn angel. Like, it's weird, man. It's so weird and out there. And again, for for audience members of yours who are like, what are you guys talking about? I think that's why we ultimately went back to the version who's Superman's cousin, because it's a much quicker, cleaner explanation. But we have the same starting point, and I feel like I've always kind of had a weird sense of Supergirl because of where I started. But I did find that Kara Zor-El version that was reintroduced in the early to mid 2000s to be particularly compelling. The Supergirl TV show, I enjoyed the early seasons. I fell off as it went along, and I do think that she was a tremendously endearing version of the character. But yes, ultimately, like you said, because they didn't have to differentiate, we didn't get Superman introduced until a little while in. Ended up being a very Superman-esque version of the character. And I don't think that's the sweet spot for Supergirl. I think you really do want to drill down on what makes the character distinct. And it's the fact that she didn't grow up here. I mean, again, I don't want to take us too far afield, but like that was the biggest thing with the Supergirl show, was that she got here when she was older, but then she was raised, she spent her, formative adolescent years being raised by humans. And so she ends up having a very like Clark Kent-esque upbringing, to an extent at least. And again, I think where the character shines is where you really drill down on the fact that she was born on Krypton. She knew Krypton. And again, that she was meant to be this protector, and then ends up being like the little sister, so to speak. So I think that's what makes a more interesting version of the character. And again, like that's what you get here.
Yeah, I think so too. That aspect you said, like the protector aspect, where that's been inverted now. So she just gets back here after, and like immediately her whole impression of what she was supposed to do is completely inverted, and she gets thrust in this little sister role. And also, like you said, she's got this, like we'd said, she's got all this trauma from losing her world and the whole Brainiac stuff. So it makes sense for her to be like even, a lot more brash and a lot more, overprotective than Superman, which I think too is kind of a missed opportunity here, because you could have done those overprotective aspects that they give to Superman's character. I think it would have worked better if they gave that to Supergirl instead.
Yeah, I agree. And just as a side note, have you read the Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow miniseries that Tom King
Yes.
wrote? Which will be the basis allegedly of the upcoming Supergirl movie. But like that really taps into that trauma that she's experienced. So yeah, it's funny because like when you talk about the Superman family, whether you should even go down that road or not, and the comics have gone back and forth. But yeah, it's like when you can carve a specific path or lane for each of those characters. That's right. Like, yeah, like there's room for all of them. And so something like Woman of Tomorrow and, and these stories we're talking about, I think do that.
Yeah, I think so too. And, just my personal thing, I think it was kind of a missed opportunity to age up John Kent, and where I think like even like his sexuality stuff, I think would have really worked with Connor from like all the fan gossip about him and Tim over the years. And I think you could have done a lot of that stuff with Connor instead and keep John as a kid. And I think that would have made for a much more interesting dynamic.
I'll say really quickly, I've really been enjoying the current Superman titles. Honestly, like we mentioned, House of Brainiac, I've been enjoying this era of the books, but uh, Connor and John, visually at least, like it's kind of hard to tell them apart sometimes. Like they occupy a very similar space now in the Superman books, and I don't think that's a positive. And I think had you allowed Connor to remain the older Superboy, and then you have this young John Kent, now you kind of have space for each of them. So yeah, the aging of John Kent continues to be a sore spot.
Yeah.
Even though I like the older John stories that we've gotten, but it's like, I don't know, we could have gotten there eventually. Like I really don't love the shortcut that they took.
Or we could have gotten it as like an Elseworlds type thing or something like that. But I felt the same thing when I was reading I can't remember which one. I can't remember if it was the Metallo one or the Supercorp one. But when John has this like anxiety about the super twins, I'm just like, this story probably would have meant a lot more to me if it was Connor and a young John and that conflict, because Connor's not really Clark's son. He's this clone instead. And then you've got the real son coming along. So I think that would have made for at least for me personally, I think it would have made for a much more interesting dynamic. And then too, like I said, the sexuality aspect, now that you've got that with Tim, you could have had Connor and Tim, and I think that would have made a lot more sense.
You probably have a whole contingent of there would be backlash, but there would also be a contingent of fans who would be all there for it. So,
oh yeah,
no, but like your point though about the biological son versus the clone / adopted son or little brother or whatever you want to call it, I think that is a compelling dynamic. I mean the super family has really grown in the books, kind of as that are going on right now, and I remain split on whether that's the best or not.
Yeah, I think they maybe, I like some of the expansion, but I think maybe they expanded it too much. But ultimately, like taking this back to this movie, having those specific lines of differentiation between these very similar characters is very important, because otherwise you do get a sense where when we had Supergirl on TV and then Superman showed up, it was while it was fun, I love seeing Tyler Hoechlin in those early episodes. It was also kind of an idea of like, well, they're basically the same. There's not much differentiation going on here. Excuse me.
Yeah, I know, I agree. Like I especially, not to harp on this poor TV show, but like the fact that they positioned, as the series went on, Kara becomes a reporter, right? So like another aspect so yeah, I agree. I agree.
Now to take it back fully to this movie, the Jonathan Kent aspect of it, and that was, I do remember, like, even though this story has faded in parts from my memory, like the two big things I always remember from this story are the changes they made to Brainiac and the idea that Superman had never encountered the original Brainiac. And the other thing I remember is Jonathan's death. And what did you feel about the fact that they completely excised Jonathan?
It was weird to me. And again, I didn't remember much about the movie going in, but I was 99% sure they didn't go down that road at all, because I really had no memory of it from the movie. And obviously that proved right. But yes, the comic book storyline that the movie is based on culminates in Superman rescuing and enlarging the bottle city of Kandor from Brainiac's ship at the same moment that Jonathan Kent dies. After Brainiac sends one of his probes to the Kent farm and he saves Martha, and then he has a heart attack and he dies. And look, at the time in the comics, I was not the biggest fan of the killing of Jonathan. I love both parents being alive and being there. And at the time, I felt like, well, this was Jeff Johns trying to bring the current version of the comics in line with the Richard Donner movies. I've since relaxed my position a bit. And in going back to the Superman Brainiac storyline, I think there is something very beautiful, tragically beautiful about this notion that he is regaining this connection to his home world as Kandor is saved and enlarged. And then that gives way to this new Krypton storyline where Kandor, it becomes its own planet and of course comes into conflict with Earth. And it's like a 2-year saga. But hand in hand with that, literally at the same time, he's losing his Earth father. And the juxtaposition of that is tremendously compelling. And here it's just completely omitted. And even if they didn't, and it's just, I don't know. It's odd to me. I'm curious, like your take. Do you think it was just they thought it would be too upsetting for viewers, particularly younger viewers? And even if they didn't want to go so far as Jonathan dying, they still could have had scenes of Clark and Jonathan or Clark and Martha. I mean, we get, the Martha Kara scenes, right? And those are solid. But literally the only time you see Jonathan, he's snoring on the couch. It was such a baffling choice to me. What did you make of it?
No, I felt the same way. And, I mean, a lot of times in these Superman adaptations, there's Martha kind of gets shortchanged. So it's nice that they gave her at least some attention. Because, and I also like what they did with her in Superman and Lois as a result of that too. But it was curious to me because, yeah, and I do recall wasn't there a scene in the original story of like Clark and Jonathan talking about this stuff too? And I think especially when you've got this thing about Superman being so overprotective, Clark being so overprotective about Lois, about Kara, I think having some sort of interaction with someone calling him to task for this, who's not one of them, but is someone outside of it. And like, especially Jonathan having had that experience of being an overprotective father, like we've seen in a lot of different versions of him. I think having some sort of interaction there would have been important, especially with this overprotective aspect. If you have this contrast of Superman, trying to restore Kandor while at the same time Jonathan is dying, and maybe that helps him realize that as much as he tries, he cannot protect everything. I think that would have also had a much stronger way of getting that message across.
It's this weird thing where, understandably, right, Clark needs to have some sort of emotional arc in this story. And again, I think the comic book basis provided one that for whatever reason, the filmmakers decided they wanted to steer away from. And so where they landed was this hiding the Lois relationship dynamic, which, like we talked about, I think it's just odd and not the right note. And it doesn't connect thematically the way I think the filmmakers think it does or intended it to. So I don't know why they left the Jonathan piece of it on the table. Like I said, even if they didn't want to go so far as Jonathan dying for whatever reason, I still think there's a way where you could incorporate the character. Or again, even if it's not Jonathan, even if it's Martha, like you can also have Martha have a scene with Clark. It doesn't need to just be Kara. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I think the movie does lose a little something for it, because otherwise, I don't know. Even when we get to the point where Superman is trapped in Kandor, and one thing I thought was particularly odd was that even though there's a red sun and he gets weak and he falls when he flies too close to the red sun, but he still retains at least some measure of his powers, which, once again, I don't mean to be a comic book purist, but it's like, generally speaking, one of the whole things with Kandor is like when he's in there, he doesn't have his powers. That's creates a challenge for him and makes it interesting. It's like when he's there, again, he's connected to his home world, he's around his people, but he's not quote unquote Superman in that sense. And so here I felt it was a major cheat that he retained that. But even there, like once he's in Kandor and he encounters Zor-El and Allura and they share a meal together, I don't know, there's something there, but it's still like I don't know, just from an emotional standpoint for the character of Clark, I don't think this movie gives him enough. I think they try to pin too much on the hiding the relationship angle.
No, I agree too. And I also felt that about the way he escapes. It did kind of feel like Superman's whole plan was just punch stuff hard and and somehow it'll all work out. So I felt like that was kind of a disservice to the character's intelligence in a way. Yeah, and I think and also the ending too. The way he just suddenly publicly reveals his relationship to Lois and then proposes to her right on the spot was, I felt it was a little bit much. And especially how they're having these relationship conversations still while the rest of the Daily Planet is still all gathered around it. It felt a little bit awkward to me watching it.
I agree. Yeah, it felt like, I don't know, overkill or a hat on a hat. It's like you could have ended with a kiss, right? And now the relationship is public and just leave it there. The proposal just felt like, all right, pump the brakes here.
Yeah. And also, did I miss something, or is there not a scene of Kara reuniting? As a side note, I've always called her Kara because I had a friend whose name was pronounced Kara, so it's always been Kara in my head. Um, so when you had talked about that on your show, I was just like, really? I always thought it was Kara. But fair point. I remember you said it came from Smallville. They called her Kara. But I do. Did they have a scene where she is reunited with her parents? Did I miss something like that, or?
Oh, that's a good question. Wait a minute. Oh, now I'm racking my brain. Well, they enlarge. Oh no, there is because they enlarge the city on that planet under a red sun at the end. Is there not a scene? No, there is a scene where they run together and embrace.
Okay.
Unless I'm totally imagining that. I
No,
don't
no,
think
it might be
there's
like I was kind of. It was late when I was watching this movie, so I think I may have blinked it or something.
if I mean, unless I'm totally blanking here, I don't think there's much, if anything, in the way of dialogue, but there is the enlarging of Kandor on this planet with the red sun, and I think Kara running towards her parents and them embracing. So there's at least that.
Okay, and well, that's something too. Is like I wonder, does Kara decide to stay with them on this planet? Does she decide to stay on Earth? I think having some closure on that aspect, I think, would have also been good, especially if you're going to cut off the proposal and give us a bit more closure to Kara's story. I think would have been better.
Well, and also it seems like Superman just kind of decides this is where Kandor is going to go. I feel like, and again, and I do the, on my show all the time too. It's like I know just Monday morning quarterback, and I know it's easy to look at this movie that's over a decade old and be like, oh, you should have done this. It just feels like, especially having read that new Krypton saga, 2008, 2009, that 2-issue storyline where Kandor is enlarged and again becomes its own planet and is in conflict with Earth. It felt like there was a much more interesting movie here that was just overlooked. And in fairness, if they really were just looking at those 4 issues of Action Comics that comprise the Brainiac storyline, okay, fine. But I feel like had they tapped more into the Kandor side of this, could have been a lot more interesting. Obviously, that's not the direction they went, but again, even just something as simple as, where, because again, in that new Krypton story, like what creates this tension is that they are enlarged on Earth. So now you have 100,000 Kandorians with the power of Superman. And so you have this intense force that's now on the planet, and what effect that has. So I don't know. Yeah, there were a lot of things here that I guess I just wish they went down a different road, but it is what
No,
it
I think so
is.
too. And especially because like I'm not very familiar with the pre-crisis Superman, but my understanding is like one of the whole things was that he hadn't found a way to enlarge Kandor, and he's been trying to find a way to do this. And so that it felt a little odd for him to just be like, oh yeah, I just happen to know an inhabitable planet where there's a red sun that I could just toss him over there on.
Well, that's a funny thing, where yeah, in the pre-crisis comics, it was this honestly this ongoing failure of his to restore the city to its proper size. And then eventually there's a story in the late Bronze Age where he finally figures it out. And the Kandorians decide they want to live under a red sun. And that's that. But in the Jeff Johns Gary Frank Brainiac story, it is similar to the movie here in that there's not much to do with enlarging the city. Like it's just sort of you uncork it and it enlarges, which I'm kind of split. I don't know. Overall, I think I kind of like it because you had all those pre-crisis stories where Superman couldn't figure it out. And here it's like, okay, once they're rescued, now the city can enlarge. And so we just get right to it. So I guess I kind of appreciate it. But it is kind of funny when you think about the long history of how do we enlarge the city? And here it's just like, yeah, once it's off the ship, you just kind of pop it and you're good to go.
And then you just happen to just toss it on the nearest inhabitable planet surrounding a red sun.
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, yeah. But I think you make a good point. I think this would have been a lot more interesting too if this was like the first part and then it led into a new Krypton movie. I think would have been a lot more interesting, and you could play around with some of these ideas a little bit more. Um, I think a big part of this too is just the fact that, especially at this time, I don't know why they felt like they were so confined to this 75-minute runtime. I remember when Bernie was on, we talked about All-Star Superman. I complained about this then, and he said that at that time, like they were kind of divided up because of to fit like within programming blocks on Cartoon Network. So that might be why they were still sticking to this here. But I do feel like if they'd added a little bit more time to these movies, they could have explored some of this stuff a little bit more.
That's a good. So my understanding was always that it was budgetary. I mean, the point that he brings up, I could see it being that as well. Although, I mean, I don't know offhand. These animated movies, do they often get run on
Well,
TV?
apparently
I mean,
back then they did. I don't know about now. Now it's a question.
gotcha. But again, like again, my understanding was always that it was budgetary. But either way, yeah, like that 75-minute runtime was pretty firm. Although now that's been expanded because I know the more recent ones have been more in the like 90-minute category. But still, I think there are those parameters that they have to fit within. And going back again to Superman Doomsday, there was an instance where they tried to cover this sweeping saga with 3 acts in 75 minutes, and there was a lot that they really had to shortchange to get it there. Uh, New Frontier is, I know, another example that people cite. I actually think that's a strong adaptation. I feel like they were able to kind of distill that down to its core idea. Now we've seen subsequent adaptations that have done 2-part movies, like Dark Knight Returns, like the death of Superman, and then the reign of the Supermen. But yeah, here, like, we were firmly in that 75-minute category, for better or worse. One of the more curious decisions to me was a mid-credit scene in this, teasing Brainiac's return, and it's like, for what? Like, there's, I mean, unless they were like, that's the thing I wonder though, and I don't know if you came across anything. Like, was there an idea of doing a sequel to this? I mean, I not that I'm aware of, but it seems like they had some intention based on that.
So I'll be honest, I have never seen this mid-credit sequence. I never knew it existed because it wasn't a thing that these DC movies were known for. So I just stopped it after when the credits started rolling. And then I was just reading on Wikipedia, like I got the summary here, and it says in a post-credit scene, he remains in the Fortress of Solitude. So I'm like, oh, okay. I should have watched a little bit longer.
It's this quick little thing where, and I literally, as you and I are recording this, I just put out an episode on my adventures with Superman season 2, and I don't want to spoil anything, but this idea of like, why the hell would you save any part of Brainiac? What are you doing? And so it's a similar type of thing here, where you have this mid-credit scene in the fortress with like the remaining pieces of Brainiac are there in the fortress, and then you see the 3 orbs light up. And like I said, it's just like, it's kind of baffling to me, unless they were planning to do more. And like, I have no idea, but yeah, I don't know. It's just weird.
I mean, I guess I don't think they were planning to do more. I haven't seen anything about that. My only guess is they just wanted to throw that in, just kind of like, the horror movie ending, where like the monster's still out there, or just like, or also the fact that, they're still, just like as a hint that he's still out there somewhere. I think it was just kind of like one of those things where, kind of like what the post-credit sequence scene of the first Iron Man movie it was not supposed to lead to a bigger thing, because that whole movie was a Hail Mary. It was just, let's just throw this in as like a fun nod to the fans. So I think that's really what all it was.
It's crazy to think back to those days, man.
Yeah. But anyway, I think that's all we have to say about Superman Unbound. Bad title and all. But any final words you had on this movie?
As always, I respect the work that went into it. I don't think this was particularly strong. As I was watching it, I said, because going into this again, I said to myself, you know what? I've really come around on the Brainiac story that inspired it. I might get a lot more mileage out of it now. Maybe this is something I should have kept in my DVD Blu-ray collection. Maybe this is something I should have rewatched. I am glad I watched it. I enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you having me on. But yeah, as I was watching it, I'm like, I just don't think this is particularly strong. I guess if someone is particularly intrigued by Supergirl or Brainiac or both, and if you really are a big fan of that Jeff Johns, Gary Frank story, it's worth at least checking out. But yeah, I feel like they just left so much on the table, and it's not a standout for me.
No, I think I mostly there with you too. I remember enjoying it a lot more the first time I watched it as opposed to this time. it's not a worthless movie by any stretch of the imagination. It's still entertaining enough. Like we said, the Supergirl stuff is great. The Brainiac stuff is really good. But as a Superman movie, I think it kind of misses the mark more than it hits. But anyway, Anthony, thank you so much again for coming on. It was nice to finally talk about a Superman movie with you here on the show. But why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. It's always fun when we can connect. So I host two Superman podcasts. There's Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey where we cover the character across time and media. This year, a sizable portion of our coverage has been devoted to Clark as Superboy across media, and it's really been a fascinating journey for myself, and hopefully the audience has been enjoying. And then we also have another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, where we go episode by episode through the classic 1950s George Reeves television series. So Digging for Kryptonite and another exciting episode, both available wherever you get podcasts. And Digging for Kryptonite has handles on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. So I hope people will check out the shows and connect on social media.
Okay, great. As for us, we are superherocinemaphiles.com and Super Cinema Pod on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. So please make sure to follow us on there. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate it if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.